Just see, got it.
So
Yep.
Good evening to
Now.
everybody. Maybe mute their microphones. We're going to wait a few minutes to see if some more people come, because a lot more people have signed up for this.
Candidate who's increasingly raising more money out of state, and why the race for governor is quickly becoming a national race. And the reality check on voter fraud in Florida.
Okay, so let's see.
Feel sick. I did. I just woke up with like cold-like symptoms, and I know too many people that have breakthrough cases right now, so I was very sick to.
We'll wait till 7:05, I think, and then we'll get going because there's a lot to cover. So, do most of you have students who have some sort of learning difference? You can unmute and tell me. Nobody's telling me.
Yes.
Yes, I have a sophomore.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay. Please join. We're gonna get rid of this in a second. Please keep it on mute. Is that okay? You know, it's 17.
I'm an 11th grader who has dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Okay. I spent many years working at Dwight School, and they have a Quest program, and we had, I would say, maybe 25% of the students had one of the dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, this is ADHD. So I'm very familiar with the challenges that come with that. Let's see. 7:03. Still nobody else to admit. So I think oh, here's somebody I know. I think we'll get started because I want to cover a lot of information. So when you talk about this topic, it's complicated because there are so many different things that have to be taken into consideration. It's college selection is something that we want our children to take the lead on normally, right? At the same time, let me just admit, at the same time, there are so many things we have to think about that we can't necessarily give them free range to pick what they want, right? Because we have to be sure that they will have what they need in terms of accommodations and help with all of the aspects of student life. So first of all, I am not a learning differences expert. I'm a college expert. So what I will be talking about, I'm going to cover a lot of information that has to do with what students are legally entitled to, but that is not really my field of expertise. My expertise, as I said, is finding the right colleges for these kids. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing the waiting room. What, can you see the waiting room? Or only my slides? I'm gonna stop share for a minute.
Only your slides.
Okay. Okay, you can see that this is not my forte either. Okay, so when we're talking about kids with learning differences, the terminology keeps shifting because they're differences, really not disabilities. And that word is used throughout, and the universities use it and the government uses it. But neurodivergency is really the more acceptable term, I think, because that's the umbrella under which all of these different ways of being wired fall, right? And there are more even than this. And I think that it's that recognition that this is not a disability, it's simply a difference in the way that information is processed and the way that our children think. So when you get started in this process, as I started to say, you're going to have to decide how much you're going to focus on the facilities first, or the accommodations that the schools provide first. In other words, looking at what are the schools that have the best or the most comprehensive programs, or are you going to look first at what are the schools my child wants to attend, and does that school offer the accommodations that as a family we believe are really necessary for the student to thrive. Okay, the first thing you're going to have to determine is going to be all of these questions. It's not the thing, the things. So what exactly is the student's, again, disability, and when was it diagnosed? So is the student in a college prep, a modified, an individualized, or a special ed course? Because this is going to make a big difference as well. What accommodations are provided right now? Because kids get used to being helped all along the way in some schools. And if they're going to need that kind of support initially at college, then that is a limiting factor when you start really considering the schools, because not all the schools will have what your children are used to in terms of services. What are the long and short-term goals of your child, and are they realistic? Or if I'm talking to students, are you being realistic in terms of your goals? You know your own capabilities. They can be totally open-ended and anything you want to do is fine, or you may have some limitations in your ability to process quickly, or in your math abilities, or in other areas. And then it's going to be what level of service is needed in the college. And this is where it starts to become tricky. Okay. So levels of support vary tremendously from school to school. And they're usually divided into these three categories, which are basic, moderate or structured, and comprehensive. So basic, every school will have some sort of basic accommodations for students. It's federally mandated if they receive money from the government. But what they are required to provide is called reasonable. And so what is a reasonable degree of service? And is it enough for you or for your child? And is this is for students really who are needing minimal accommodations. These programs may not have any really professional learning specialists. So according to the American Disabilities Act, they have to provide a learning center usually that will support, or a disabilities office, but that doesn't necessarily provide a centralized approach. So in many cases, the student will meet initially with someone in the disability office who will determine what accommodations are reasonable. That person will usually stay with the student all through the 4 years, because it will change from semester to semester in terms of who needs to be notified and in what way. How the professors are notified is going to change. So in many schools, the person in charge of the student in the student disability office, after deciding on what accommodations are needed and reasonable, will write a letter that explains all of that. And the letter will either be sent by the office by email to the student's professors, or in most cases, the student will physically receive these letters and will have to go and advocate for themselves, go to their professors and say, this is what I need, talk about how they can meet those requirements, where they'll be testing. When it's basic accommodations, it doesn't mean that there's a center where it's quiet and the students are given their tests under optimal conditions. It simply means they will be given extra time, or they will be separated from the other students, or whatever the accommodations provide. So that's for a student who really is used to self-advocating, is confident, feels very comfortable speaking with professors, and is not worried about any of this, okay? Most schools will have what we're calling moderate or structured services. These generally will require specific documentation of the learning disability. The other one will too. I should have had that there. The services will be provided by at least one learning disability specialist. So there's going to be somebody on staff in the disabilities office who has been certified as a specialist. They won't be simply administrative staff that's been hired to handle students' needs. They typically will give accommodations that go beyond what the Americans with Disability Act requires. They typically have a learning center where kids will take their exams, and it's a distraction reduced environment for them. They may provide some assistance in time management and organization. They might have students able to schedule meetings with specialists, but how often they can schedule a meeting will depend on how many students are requiring services and how many people they actually have working with the students. These are almost always no additional cost unless you're seeking some kind of special tutoring that isn't included with general tuition. And then we get to comprehensive. So the comprehensive programs are the ones that would be the most structured, the most services, and will meet the needs of the students who are used to having full access to all kinds of services in their own high schools. So usually the director and staff are certified in learning disabilities. The services are very structured, with students often involved in developing their own plans to meet their learning styles. There's almost always an additional fee for this, and it can be a lot. And it ranges from a one-time fee, thousands of dollars, to $1,500, $1,700, $1,300 a semester, depending on the school and what the student is receiving. So just quickly to take a look at how high school is different from college in terms of disability services. First of all, there are no IEPs or special eds courses in colleges. They don't have to provide the same level of support and service as a kid gets in high school, such as the specialized instruction or tutoring. Students have to register as a student with disabilities to get accommodations, and they'll have to provide evidence of the disability. And what they have to provide differs from school to school, but most of them will require that any documentation is no more than 3 years old. So for some students, this will mean they have to retest, go back to their psychologist, take the tests, get a new evaluation to bring to college. They'll be assigned a dedicated person, but again, this is just going to be to determine the reasonable accommodations. And basically what the law says is all students should have equal access, that there's no discrimination. So that's the main point of the Disability Acts. And a lot of what it covers is not about the academic side. It has to do with access to buildings, with access to devices that will help them if they have hearing problems, those sorts of things, right? Rather than the kinds of things that you get right now in high school potentially. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the schools with comprehensive programs. And many of you might be very familiar with these schools because most of them are the names that you hear all the time in terms of schools with really strong programs for children with learning differences. Some of them, very few students in New York apply to, or in the New York public private school system will apply to for any reason other than for their advanced learning programs. So I never, in 12 years of counseling in a high school, I never had a student who didn't need additional support say, I want to go to Curry College, or I'm dying to go to Landmark. These are schools, these first three, and Beacon as well, that really are primarily interesting to students who need a very high level of support. And some of them will do only 2 years at a school like this and then move on. But those are the ones that most people are familiar with. Landmark, I know, has a wonderful summer program as well. So I did have, when I was at Dwight, one student who prior to coming to Dwight, in the interim between, I had a lot of students from Windward and Gaynor and different schools that only went to the 8th grade for children with learning differences. The Landmark summer program was a good transitional program between 8th grade and high school. And then you have these very well-known schools that students apply to regardless of whether they need extra support or not. These will have, you can see, specific programs. So when you apply to American University, if you want to have the specific program, which will also have an additional fee, you apply in addition to American University, you're applying to the Learning Services program. Very well-known one is University of Arizona SALT program. That's one that I had students apply to almost every year. Northeastern has a top-ranked disabilities program. Hofstra has an outstanding one. And then High Point is one that most people don't know. It's not a popular school yet in the Northeast. It's growing. It has a system of double advisors. So even for kids who have not enrolled in the Mitchell Learning Excellence program that went over there by mistake, they'll have a life advisor and an academic advisor. So they have an advisor, all students have an advisor who's just watching out for them, who's making sure that they're getting involved in activities, that they're going to class, that they're basically thriving. Adelphi has one of the really old and well-known learning programs. Leslie in Boston has a strong one. I visited Lynn's Institute for Achievement and Learning recently in Florida. It was an amazing program, totally separate facility where the kids went and had access to all sorts of instruction and specialists, in addition to a place to take their exams and all of the other things, all of the software and things they needed. Marist in Poughkeepsie is another pretty well-known program. And then one that I didn't realize existed that is ranked very high on the list of comprehensive programs is UConn. So University of Connecticut has a program called Beyond Access that's also really strong. So here's the thing though. Let me go back to, you aren't necessarily accepted in a program when you're accepted in the college. So a lot of these schools have double applications. So you're applying to Marist as a Marist student, but you also are applying to their special education program. And it's possible to get accepted in one and not in the other. So you can apply early decision or early action to Northeastern and get into Northeastern and then discover that you did not get into their special program. So it's something you want to start early because these programs fill up. They have a limited number of places and you want to be sure that you've taken the time to do it. You also, before you go any place in terms of applications, you need to do your homework. And you need to get as much information about the programs as you can, because you are looking for a fit. So you're not only looking for a fit in the University of college now, you're also looking to make sure that what they're offering is a fit for yourself or your child. I recommend that if you're taking a campus tour, you go to the Office of Disabilities and you speak with someone who can answer your questions and let you know what the limitations or the really exceptional points of their programs are. If you can't go, call. See if you can make an appointment to speak with a specialist and be sure you know what you're getting into. You want to always be sure that you'll have looked to see if there are additional applications and how much work those entail, because they can be really labor intensive. And so if you're applying to those, you've got to send 2 applications basically, and you may have more diagnostic tests. You may have to get special letters from educators. You may have to write essays that are in addition to the supplements for the college. And then don't forget to think about your budget, because some of these are very, very expensive. So that's another consideration, that you can apply for scholarships and financial aid, that's fine, but adding these learning disability programs can add thousands of dollars to the overall cost each year. So what I did here, I just took an example of what you need to do, these extra things you have to do if you were deciding to apply to the learning support program at Marist. And you can see this is a lot. This is really a lot. Okay, so you've got the 2 applications. You've got to submit directly to the Office of Accommodations and Accessibility the results of your psych evaluation within the past 3 years. It has to include all of these things. You have to have an educational evaluation that provides current levels of achievement in math, reading, and written expression. You have to present, if you have an IEP or a 504 plan, present that. 2 letters of recommendation of people who are familiar with your learning style. So this is not necessarily the regular letters of recommendation. You have to have your official high school transcript, that's fine. Then you have an essay as specified in the learning support program application. The SAT and ACT, forget. The application fee, this is another $25. This is not the Marist regular application fee. When both of these applications are complete and all of the information is received, then it will be reviewed. And after it's been reviewed, the most qualified will be invited to interview. So you're still not done. I was surprised at how complicated applying to a private school in New York City is. This is equally tedious because you have different requirements for different schools. And then again, be aware that it's competitive and you may not get it. So a whole lot of work. And then in the end, you may not get it. So in addition to those schools that I had the logos for that people know, I did some digging, and there are new programs that appear all the time. And one of the reasons for this is that schools are very, very concerned about meeting their goals for inclusion. And one of the categories for inclusion is people who learn in different ways. So there are some schools that really actively seek students who may need extra support. So the first of these that surprised me, I've been sending students to University of Vermont for 15 or 20 years, but I never really understood their comprehensive accessibility services. So they have extensive resources available. And the center provides all sorts. I mean, they have to have their documentation, but they're not applying for a program in the same way as some of these other ones. They provide personal devices. They have a testing center. They have note-taking programs in the center. They help communicate with the residential life people, ensuring that the kids are getting support that they need. And there's no extra cost. So this is one of those. I love the University of Vermont. It has early action. It's one of those schools I recommend it to students anyway. Burlington is a great small town. It's a great school, and it's an interesting option if money is of concern and your child or you yourself need extra support in school. Southern Methodist University is another one that has exceptional services for kids with documented learning disabilities. They have support services designed to give students creative intervention strategies to be successful in their academic careers. They offer coaching sessions that are tailored to the kids' course load and experiences. And they actually have a specific class on learning strategies designed specifically for kids with learning disabilities and ADHD. And the kids can participate in lots of workshops or seek one-on-one support to help them understand their diagnosis. So that's another one that has wonderful support system. I had no idea that Chapel Hill was considered one of the top schools for kids with ADHD and some other learning disabilities. Nothing costs extra money. Kids can make appointments with specialists through the websites. And again, neurodiversity is celebrated on this campus. So the wider student body is given opportunities to understand neurodiversity as well. So a school like this that embraces neurodiversity is interesting for kids, especially those who sometimes have felt stigmatized because they've had to seek out extra services. UC Irvine, for some reason, of the UC schools, is the one that is always comes up as the school with the best disability services center. And this is also the same thing, engaging with students creatively and helping to shatter these stigmas and stereotypes. So if you see their statement, neurodiversity is an important part of having a vibrant community, it makes it easier for these kids to go to seek the support that they need and request different kinds of instructional materials which are made available to them. So I would say they also offer the larger student population, the opportunity to participate in a 3-hour workshop to become a formal ally for students with learning differences. So when you think about a gigantic UC university providing children with allies in the student body and people who understand them and have actively sought to engage with students who learn differently, it makes a compelling case for looking at UC Irvine over some of the other University of California campuses. DePaul is one that I don't know if many of you are familiar with, it's in Chicago. It also has a wonderful process, but the kids have to go through a process where they disclose their disability, bring their proper documentation in order to gain the support they want. But then they can choose on one-on-one with a learning specialist, clinician, and then they have fee for service that is specific to that resource. But there are lots of free ways to access adaptive technologies and additional support. And that's a school also that has a really strong arts and theater department. So it's an interesting school to look at. Instead of the logo for University of Denver, I put this little brain because it says embrace neurodiversity. And they have a very strong learning effectiveness program too. And that comes with weekly one-on-one counseling, subject-specific tutoring, executive functioning support, social skill buildings, all of these different things. And there is, I didn't know this existed either, Delta Alpha Pi, International Honor Society, Academic Honor Society for students with disabilities. So you can see they're seeking every possible way to embrace the students who need extra help and to include them in all the areas of their education. And I just have a few more. This is another one that's amazing because here you got it. Diversity and inclusion are emphasized focal points in Middlebury's mission. So they are considered to be one of the top colleges for students with learning disabilities. They actually, I didn't get data for the COVID year, but 2018, 2019, 1 out of every 7 students on campus self-identified as having some kind of disability, which is really quite a amazing statistic. 1 out of 7 is a lot. And they have a comprehensive disability resource center that students can use to seek support and accommodations and services. All of this note-taking and all of that is available at that center. And finally, Syracuse, which of course is really popular with New York students, put in a program last year that's called On Track. So if you look at what their mission is, a lot of it has to do with helping students develop their own learning profile. They have a lot of emphasis on helping students with social needs as well as academic, but they have customized learning profiles, student-driven plans of action, individual support, all of those things. They enroll in the first year and have the option to continue in scaled down version, but you can see what this costs. So first year is going to cost an additional $3,000. And after that, it's going to go to $1,500. So again, this becomes basically these fees are prohibitive for some families, very stressful for others. Lucky families who are able to pay it, but it's something you do want to factor in when you're thinking about your college choices. So I'd like now for you to ask questions because I've been talking and talking and talking. So let me see. I have here one question, able to get a copy. We'll make sure you can get a copy of this because I know otherwise you had to be jotting down all this information. I tried to give as much as I could in a short amount of time. All of this is accessible also if you start digging and you find amazing resources online for rankings of schools that have programs, for discussions about student needs. There was one I found that I'll add it when to the website. There was a website that actually laid out how many people worked in the offices that dealt with students with who needed, what's the word? My mind is going blank. The centers. So I was looking at those and thinking, a center at a large state university that has 8 people to deal with disabilities, which also include physical, mental, other kinds of disabilities, you're not going to get much help at a school like that. So I'm looking here, what are some key look-fors when looking at a college and the supports they offer? I think the main thing to look for, if you're looking for colleges that do not have these apply into programs where you're just looking at their office for disabilities, all of them will show what they offer. So some of them have long lists of all kinds of translators and different kinds of software and note takers and peer tutoring, and it goes on. And some of them have very short lists where you can see they're meeting the government requirements, and that's pretty much it. The more people involved in these programs and the more certified specialists that they have in the centers, the more likely that the people who are working with the students are really invested in these kids. This is a vocation for them. They really want to work with students with disabilities, as opposed to an office that's pretty much just administrators. They're pushing through the papers, they're checking off the boxes to make sure that your documentation is correct, and doing that sort of thing, but they're not emotionally involved necessarily or committed in the same way as people who have taken the time to actually get certified in the field. Okay, on the main application. So a question here is, on the main application, should you indicate that there is a learning disability? I think if it's a learning disability, oh, I have people still in the admit, sorry to people who I took a long time to admit. I didn't see it. If you're looking at an application to a school where you know you are going to need support, you don't need to necessarily put it in your application. As a college counselor, I used to put it, I would check with the family and say, do you want me to disclose this? You have privacy. Do you want me to say anything? And if it was a student, either who had done amazingly well, despite, or I don't even know if that's the right word, but along with the differences. Who am I hearing? Karen. Okay, so there are kids who they would be getting 90s and 95s and 97s in reading intensive classes where reading was so laborious for these students that I would mention it in my letter of recommendation. I would confirm with the parents, but I like to be able to say that this was a student who had whatever and had found the strategies to enable him or herself to excel, and that it's something that's admirable. It's something that the schools cannot use that information in their decisions. They absolutely cannot. No one can disclose it. There are privacy laws unless the student and the parent have agreed. And that's something else for when we were talking about the differences between high school and college for disability programs. As a parent, you have no rights unless your child and the the college itself, somebody in the, I'm not sure which office, we'd have to see if it's the registrar's office or which office, has signed off on it. You cannot talk to the people in the disabilities office. They will share nothing with you. And this is also true of grades. So if you're trying to track your child's grades to see how things are going, you also have to have your child sign off and give permission. Once they're 18, you have no rights other than to pay the bills, and you always have that right. So you want to take care of those things as well to be sure if you want to be tracking how your child is doing. Any resource that help. There are definitely resources that help match specific disabilities with specific schools. I will put that on a spreadsheet for everybody who's been here. There are schools that have a focus on autism. There are schools that have a focus on ADHD. There are lots of different programs that do have pretty specific programs, in addition to having the general information or accommodations available. Are accommodations and housing handled in the same place? Okay, so if you need an accommodation and housing for a reason that involves physical accommodations, the staircases or access to different places, let's say in a dorm, that would be through the Office of Disabilities. If you need like, I had a student who needed a service dog. That went through the disabilities office. In order for her to have that in her dorm, that was a combined program. And so it's going to depend on what the need is. There are schools where to get a single is all you do is pay, and that's fine. But there are others where it's virtually impossible as a freshman to get a single. So if you had some kind of a condition that required the student to have a single, it would be also a combination of going through the disabilities, and it would depend on the school whether they would go directly to coordinate with the housing or whether they would give you or your student the documentation you needed. So I think what I saw, since I worked with many children over a long period of time who had been using what was called Quest at Dwight, working with specific learning specialists, the biggest problem they had when they started college was time management, because they were used to having someone reminding them, constantly reminding them, in addition to their parents. So I think for some students, they can handle the initial getting the accommodations, going to their teachers, getting the extra time. But sometimes what they need is that extra support in terms of follow-up, that someone is actually keeping in touch to make sure that they are going to classes, that they are keeping up with their work. And that you're definitely not going to get where it's basic accommodations, a basic service program. You might get in a small school that has the in-between, the moderate amount of accommodation. You will definitely get in a comprehensive program. So I can say personally, I had 2 family friends who had their children living at home, going to state universities, and didn't know they had flunked out until they didn't get a bill. And one student was getting dressed every morning, putting on his backpack, leaving the house and going who knows where, but it wasn't to school. So, you know, as a parent, you have very limited access to what's going on unless your child signs off on it, or you're involved in one of these programs and everyone has signed off on it. So more questions. This is great. Ask some questions. So I think the best thing for me to do for you is I'm going to put together a list of websites that have all kinds of information about different kinds of programs. It's also important, it's really important to know what your rights are, what your students' rights are, what is covered with the American Disabilities Act, so that you can be sure that you're not getting blown off in a disabilities office that's very busy and is like, yeah. So that's also something that I can give you website information about. There's a wonderful question here about the HBCUs and any specific, and none of them popped up when I was doing the 20 best, the 50 best, the 30 best, but I can certainly take a look at that, and I will do that for all of you so that it's on a sheet that we can share. But you can see this is a process that college applications is daunting enough. This adds that extra level of stress, information that you need, and just time to get together everything you're going to need. So your kids, I assume the majority of them are in high school. The documentation, I haven't seen any school that has said it won't accept documentation that is less than 3 years old. Be sure that you have the documentation in order well before you hit senior year and start doing these applications. And that's something, the things that you can't control are the things you want to give plenty of time to. You can sit down and write an essay over the weekend. That's fine. But if you need to have documentation and to see a specialist and to go through whatever processes that you've done to get your accommodations in high school, you want those early. Otherwise, it's going to be a nightmare. And then I see, can you do this program again further into the year? You know what? I can do anything you guys want. So what you need to do is write to Smart City Kids, to the info at Smart City Kids, and just say what you'd like. And we can do it again if this is helpful to you. And in the meantime, you can start just doing your own leisurely fun searches online of schools that offer different programs. And this is something also that students really need to own as much as they can. So there are certain things, parents are going to determine what the budget is. Parents are going to determine some of the geographical elements. You might not want your child to go to California or to go to Alaska, whatever. You have the right to set those rules down, obviously, but the kids need to own the process in terms of where they want to study and think about, do a realistic, reflect on what careers are interesting to them, what kind of school do they need to go to, how many years of study will they need, and are they looking at schools that are feasible? Because kids, they need to apply to schools that are appropriate, that are not too easy, and are not going to be so competitive that they're going to have nervous breakdowns. And again, as I said, some of what we're calling disabilities, it's simply the way that the student processes information, or with a student who has dyslexia and doesn't have the right kind of software or tools to do the reading. You all know, anybody who went to college is used to several professors saying, have that read by the end of the week and assigning you books. And you want to be sure that the kids have the accommodations they need to be able to do that, as well as to be in an academic environment where they can thrive and not be running uphill all the time, sacrificing their social life, sacrificing activities, and just not having fun. I mean, college is the last time until they finish their education, they can have some fun. Then they start their careers. They're working from then on. So let me see, any advice to start or stop doing for our children so they can be successful? I think my biggest problem as a college counselor was either parents who were too involved in their kids' work, and so the students had never turned in an assignment that hadn't been vetted by parents. And I have to say, I was semi-guilty of that myself. It's an instinct for a lot of parents to want to see what their children are doing, or the opposite, where it's this laissez-faire and kids are able to get in deep trouble in their courses and end up with grades that aren't really representative of their abilities. So it's that balance, it's that sort of empowering them, but at the same time, they're teenagers. So making sure that they're still under your control, in the sense that you know what they're doing and that they're doing their best. So you want your kids to achieve their potential, right? But you don't want to push them to go beyond what they can do rationally. So, these kids who never sleep, who never eat because they're studying all the time, that's not healthy either. And in terms of just when you're looking at colleges, my biggest problem when I was doing in-school college counseling was parents only taking their kids to see schools that were, let's say, in the top 10 or 20%, taking them only to Ivy League schools. Let's say they go to Boston and they only look at the top ranked schools in Boston. They don't take the kids to see Clark that's outside of Boston, or a Worcester Polytechnic, or a Suffolk, or even BU in some cases. Or they will go to Philadelphia and only go to UPenn and not bother to take the time to, let's look at Drexel. And then it gives your children that sense of these other schools aren't good enough. And always telling your kids, they're all good schools. I never use the term good, it's competitive. So a less competitive school can provide a much better academic experience for students, with more hands-on research with their professors, more opportunities than a more competitive school. So if you are instilling in them this idea that these are not better schools, these are just better known schools, and the idea that when you're looking at graduate school, you're better off to be at the very top of a Drexel than at the bottom of a UPenn. So, that's another thing to think about when you're talking to your kids. So, do we have any more questions? Well, thank you all so much. I promise to follow up with the information that I offered. And if you would like to do another session or something, even a session on something entirely different, another workshop, just let Smart City Kids know, and we'll be really happy to accommodate you. This is fun for me also to see lots of different people involved in looking for more information. So have a wonderful evening, and please be in touch. Thank you for joining.